That's one of my favorite oldies, by the way. I love that song. Love the words to that song. Last Thursday was opening day 2019 Major League Baseball. And I know many of you are excited about that. I used to be. The Rangers in their current condition have kind of dampened my spirits about opening day. But anytime you talk baseball, statistics come up. And one of the common things that people like to talk about, and it's a very generational thing, is who's the greatest baseball player to ever live? My oldest son would argue that it's Barry Bonds. But I'm more the old school. To me, the greatest Willie Mays, I loved watching him when I was growing up. Mickey Mantle was one of my childhood idols. That really dates me, doesn't it? Nolan Ryan. Now, not best baseball players ever, but I loved Adrian Beltre. I'm going to really miss that guy. But I was looking online at all these different lists people put together of who the greatest baseball player ever was. And do you know who was number one on every list I could find? It's obvious. Who have I left out? Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth. He hit 714 home runs in his career. This was back in the dead ball era. And for 40 years, that record stood until Hank Aaron broke it in 1974, and then later Barry Bonds came along and even broke that record. But I'm wondering if you knew this. Babe Ruth had 1,330 strikeouts. He struck out nearly twice as much as he hit a home run. Babe Ruth failed a lot. That I don't think anyone would call Babe Ruth a failure. Then we can turn the subject to president. Who's the greatest president who ever lived? Boy, you could really get some discussion about that, can't you? George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. My father-in-law, if he was still alive, would be arguing to this day it was Franklin Roosevelt. Maybe some would say Ronald Reagan. Donald Trump would say Donald Trump. But I was looking at the list for that too. Who is it that presidential historians rank as the greatest president in history? There was a little bit of disagreement on this one. The one I'm getting ready to mention was number one on most of them. Occasionally he dropped to number two, and George Washington was number one. But I've obviously left out whom? Abraham Lincoln. Did you know Abraham Lincoln lost 8 elections before he became president? He failed in business twice. He once contemplated suicide. In fact, in his memoirs, it's written that his friends had to actually hide his razor from him. And he suffered a nervous breakdown. Abraham Lincoln failed a lot. But I don't think anyone would call Abraham Lincoln a failure. So let's go to Mark 14 again. 3 weeks ago, we were with Jesus and the disciples in the upper room as they celebrated Passover together. And during that Passover meal, Jesus introduces them to this idea of the Lord's Supper. He introduces them to the idea that I am the fulfillment of Passover. And he shows them how he fit right into that Passover narrative. He changes the meaning of it forever. And then it says they sang a hymn. And then they start heading toward the Mount of Olives. And I'm assuming that it's while they're on their way to the Mount of Olives that Jesus said this, "You will all fall away. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Peter declared, "Even if all fall away, I will not." "Truly I tell you," Jesus answered, "today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times." But Peter insisted emphatically even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. 2 weeks ago, as we were in Mark 14, we went to Gethsemane. Peter and the disciples, they're sleeping. Jesus has to face this agony, this spiritual battle alone. Last week, we saw how Jesus was arrested in the garden. And during that narrative that we looked at last week, it says Peter followed him at a distance, just as Jeremy pointed out a while ago, right into the courtyard of the high priest. People's houses back then, especially the wealthy, they were more like compounds. They had a wall around the compound, and you would enter into that compound, and there was the house, and there'd be a courtyard. And so Peter goes into the courtyard of the high priest. And there he sat, catch this, there he sat with the guards. These are the very guys that had arrested Jesus and beaten him, and Peter's sitting with them and warmed himself at the fire. And so Mark gives us another sandwich story. He sandwiches the trial of Jesus. We saw part of that trial last week. We'll see the rest of the trial next week. And in the middle, he places the trial of Peter, so that simultaneously, Jesus and Peter are being tried. And Mark is deliberately contrasting these two trials. Which brings us to our text, Mark chapter 14 and verse 66. But before I actually go there, I want to set it up a little bit, because I want us to feel some of the struggle here. Rather than just reading it, I want us to feel it. And so I want to start like this. I am so grateful for our security team that we have here at this church. Because in this crazy time in which we live, we can gather here and they help to ensure a safe environment for us to be able to worship. And I'm grateful for that. But let's assume that one Sunday they're not in place. And this crazed guy comes running down this aisle, and he has an assault weapon that he's waving around. And he points it at different ones of us. And then he comes up here and he puts it right to my head. And he's saying to us, you either deny Jesus or you die. What are you going to do? And don't be too quick to answer that, because that's the mistake Peter made. What are you going to do? I would like to think that I would gladly stand there and say, then go ahead and shoot me because I love Jesus. But in that moment, I don't know for sure. And maybe you're thinking, Rick, you're the preacher. Man, stand up for Jesus. And I know all that. And I know the verses. I know the verses like Matthew chapter 10, where Jesus said, whoever acknowledges me before others, I will acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever disowns me before others, I will disown before my Father in heaven. I know that verse. And I know what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 1 and verse 16, where he said, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God unto salvation for all who believe, to the Jew first and then to the Gentile. I know that verse. But if a man is holding a gun to my head and telling me to reject Jesus or die, I hope I would say, then let me die. But I don't know that I would. And you don't either. You can say, oh yeah, I do. That's what Peter said. And that's the situation he faces in our text. So let's read verse 66. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. You also were with that Nazarene Jesus, she said. Now, it's a cool night. It's a spring night. It's about this time of year, somewhere in this time frame that we're now in. I looked this week at the long-range forecast in Jerusalem, and nighttime temperatures are anywhere from the mid-40s to the upper 40s right now in Jerusalem. So here Peter is. It's a chilly night. And so he's warming himself by the fire in the courtyard of the high priest Caiaphas. And this teenage girl approaches him, and she looks him over. And she says, I recognize you. You're one of that Nazarene's boys. And what does Peter do? It says, but he denied it. I don't know or understand what you're talking about, he said. And he went out into the entryway. He says, Jesus, Nazarene, I have no clue. I have no clue what you're talking about. He's feeling the heat. And so he backs away from the fire, both literally as well as figuratively. And he slips out of the courtyard and he goes to the gate, to the entryway. He can make a quicker getaway from there if the unfolding of events necessitates that. But this servant girl, she's just a little bit too nosy. And so it says when the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, this fellow is one of them. Her accusation this time is much more specific than it was when she was just speaking to Peter. Instead of being with Jesus, which is what she accused him of directly, now to the crowd, she identifies Peter as one of them. And Peter's response is, again, he denied it. Also, I want you to notice that this servant girl's words this time weren't directed only at Peter. Now they're directed at the crowd. And so now the crowd is aware of this accusation, and so they're beginning to look at him more closely. They're examining him. And it says, after a little while, those standing near said to Peter, surely you are one of them, for you're a Galilean. How did they know that? Matthew tells us it's because of his dialect. Galileans spoke differently from the people in Jerusalem. And so he stood out as quickly as many of us would, and I have when Beverly and I have gone to the Northeast. It doesn't take long before people are saying, you're not from around here, are you? You're from down south. They recognize that he's not one of them. But this third accusation pushes him over the edge. In fact, he's backed into a corner now. And so verse 71 says, he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, I don't know this man you're talking about. He goes into a tirade. He's cursing. He's swearing. He's emphatically denying that he even knows who Jesus is. Now, these curses are not four-letter words, by the way. The Greek word there is actually he's anathematizing himself. What does that mean? He's calling down curses on himself. It's as if Peter is saying, if I'm lying, then let God send me to hell. And in that moment, verse 42 says, immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. When that rooster crowed, excuse the pun, but it dawned on Peter. It dawned on him what had just happened. His earlier professions of love and faithfulness and courage and loyalty, Jesus' prediction that he was going to fail, his denial that he was going to fail, his cowardly denials that he's actually just done. And so he weeps. He's brokenhearted. Because there are few things worse than realizing that you're actually as bad as you feared you might be. When I read this story, there is this self-righteousness in me that kind of comes to the top, comes to the surface. And I get a little bit angry and I get frustrated with Peter. I want to fuss at him. Peter, what in the world were you doing? You're a disciple. You saw him work miracles. He healed your mother-in-law. What are you trying to do? Get back at him now? For healing the mother-in-law, just in case you didn't get that. You saw him feed the multitudes. You saw him raise the dead. He empowered you. You, Peter, he empowered you to walk on water. What has gotten into you? That's what I want to say, don't you? Really now, don't you? But that's not what God's response is. I want us to look for a moment at how God responded to Peter. It's the following Sunday morning, 3 days later. Jesus has been in the tomb. There's these women that come early in the morning while it's still dark, and they come to anoint the body of Jesus. But there's a problem here. When you go to anoint a body, there has to be a body to anoint. But the body's gone. The tomb is empty. And this is what it says. This is the angel that happens to be there that speaks these words. Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He's risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him? But go tell the disciples and Peter. He's going ahead of you to Jerusalem, to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Have you ever wondered why the angel singled out Peter? It's as if God's saying, Peter, just because you failed does not make you a failure. I don't believe you're a failure. You may have struck out, but you get another at bat. And you know what? Because of that, Peter went on to hit grand slams for Jesus. He becomes most prominent among the apostles. He identifies himself as an elder in the church in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 1. Now, I want you to think about that. I want you to think about that. Let's imagine we're going through an elder selection process, and there's a name that's put forward, and there's somebody in the congregation that says, no, I object to him becoming an elder, because years ago, do you know what he did? Years ago, in public, someone asked him if he was a Christian, and he denied that he even knew Jesus. He can't be an elder in this church. Peter was. And not too long after this very event, who was it on the day of Pentecost that stood up in the midst of the Jewish people and said in Acts chapter 2 and verse 36, "Therefore let all Israel be assured of this, God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Messiah." Who said that? It was Peter. 2 chapters later, he and John are arrested, and they're taken before the Sanhedrin, the supreme court of the Jewish people. You talk about an intimidating place to be, to have to stand in front of those men and give testimony about yourself. And here's what he said to them: "Salvation is found in no other, for there is no other name under heaven given to mankind by which we must be saved." Again, who said that? Peter. He failed in one at bat. 3 strikes, in fact. But that didn't make him a failure. So here's the thing. Have you ever felt like Peter? Maybe you publicly said something or publicly didn't say something because you were concerned about being aligned with Jesus. Or maybe you had too much to drink and publicly shamed yourself. Or maybe you've struggled with an addiction. Or maybe there has been a time in your life where you've even had same-sex thoughts. Or maybe there's a time in your life when you had sex outside of marriage. All of us have been where Peter was. And you're saying, wait a minute, I hadn't done any of those things. Well, there's something along the line that would place you in the camp of Peter. Maybe it's that you use words that were inflammatory about another person. You knew better, but you did it anyway. You spread that piece of gossip. Here's what the deal is. Sin can be so overwhelming that we act before we think. We act in the moment rather than acting from the depths of our commitment. We deny when we should have confessed. We sin even when we know better. And maybe you felt in moments like that, maybe you felt like God could never use me again. I think Peter felt that way. In John chapter 21, Peter says, "Hey guys, let's go back to fishing. How could God ever use me again?" Maybe you felt like you're irreparable. But here's the good news. Just because we have failed does not make us failures. And God continues to choose to tell His story through failures like you and me. There are some scholars who suggest that Mark was writing his gospel to Christians who were undergoing severe persecution from the Romans. And they've suggested during that time there's some Christians that walked away from the faith because they did not want to endure the persecution. And now some of them are wanting to come back into the community. Now, what do you do if you're one of the end folks who's endured the persecution for the sake of Jesus? And now these people who had denied Him are wanting to come back. What do? Do you readmit them? After all, what could be worse than denying your faith, even if it's under duress, with a gun pointed to your head? And I think we find our answer in this very story. What's worse than denying your faith? How about denying that you even know who Jesus is? You think you're not good enough? You think you don't have a place in the body of Christ? Consider Peter. If he's one of Jesus' disciples, hey, you and I can be too. All of us. There's an interesting addition that Luke makes to this story. At that third denial that Peter makes, Luke tells us in Luke 22 and verse 61 that Jesus turned and looked at Peter. Now, I got to tell you, my theology has changed a lot in the last 25 or 30 years. Because there was a time when I read that passage. Let me back up from that and ask you this. What do you see in the eyes of Jesus right here? What do you see in his eyes? Because 25 or 30 years ago, what I saw were eyes of rebuke, eyes of scorn, as if Jesus turned to Peter and said, "Told you so." I don't see that anymore. Let me tell you what I see. I see in his eyes love. I see eyes of acceptance. I see eyes of compassion. I see eyes of grace and eyes of hope. Well, Rick, how can you come to that conclusion? Because in John chapter 21, Jesus comes to Peter and he repositions him in the kingdom. He says, "You're not a failure. I love you, and I've got some things for you to do." And I believe with all of my heart, brothers and sisters, I believe that that is the way Jesus looks at every one of us. Because just because we fail does not make us failures in the eyes of God. And so we're going to sing, and we're going to stand. And I hope if you're in a place today where you're feeling like a failure, that's a lot of why we need to be together, and we need to be more open with each other. Because there's people who will link arms with you and make a difference in your life. But you got to let us know. And so if you want to come forward to share that, or you can go out these doors and go down to room 102, which is the first room on your right, and an elder and his wife can talk to you in private right there about it and pray with you. There's some of you who need to enlist in the body of Christ, who need to become disciples of Jesus, who need to come and be baptized today. And we offer this opportunity for you too. So let's stand together and let's sing.
Lift high his royal banner, it must not suffer loss. From victory unto victory, his army shall he lead, till every foe is vanquished, and Christ is Lord indeed. Stand up for Jesus, the trumpet call obey. Forth to the mighty conflict, in this his glorious day. Ye that are men now serve him against unnumbered foes. Let courage rise with danger, and strength to strength oppose. Stand up for Jesus, stand in his strength alone. The arm of flesh will fail you, ye dare not trust your own. Put on the gospel armor, and watching unto prayer, where duty calls or danger, be never wanting there. Stand up for Jesus, the strife will not be long. This day the noise of battle, the next the victor's song. To him that overcometh, a crown of life shall be. He with the King of glory shall reign eternally. Be seated, please.